Alright guys, let's work through our 10-4 reading guide a little bit. The first question asks, explain what happens in photorespiration and why is this said to be counterproductive to the plant. And so photorespiration is this new thing that we're talking about a little bit. And basically what happens in the Calvin cycle, when normally, like what we talked about yesterday, when Rubisco would add CO2 to this 5-carbon molecule, right? That's normally what happens. Well, in photorespiration, instead of CO2, it actually adds O2. And so you end up with O2 being added instead of CO2. And ultimately, what it does, it uses ATP. It doesn't produce any ATP. It doesn't produce any sugar. And it actually decreases the effectiveness of photosynthesis. So it's a very kind of dangerous thing for the plant to begin doing this photorespiration. And so number 2 asked, explain why chapter 10 calls photorespiration evolutionary baggage. Basically, the idea is that O2 probably wasn't competitive in the early atmosphere. Like, it probably wasn't even there to be bonded. And so it didn't matter, right? And as the atmosphere changed, well, it began to pick up O2 without even kind of realizing it. And so there was no reason for Rubisco to avoid O2 at the beginning, and now there is. And so it's kind of this evolutionary baggage in that original atmosphere wouldn't have had enough O2 to even make it an issue. But now that our atmosphere is so oxygen rich, it does become an issue for the plant. And so basically this section is talking about how plants have adapted ways to deal with photorespiration, and basically kind of the 3 different types of plants that exist. And so that's what I wanted to go into a little bit today. And that's really what number 3 is asking you. What distinguishes a C3 plant, a C4 plant, and a CAM plant? And really it comes down, so this is number 3, and it comes down to how they use CO2, right? And so let's kind of go through the 3. So the first one is a C3 plant. And a C3 plant is kind of our normal plant. Okay, so this is what we talked about. Here's our chloroplast. They're still going to be doing the light reaction. That hasn't changed. And they're still taking, for the most part, in CO2, and Rubisco is adding it, and then it's splitting it into 2 3-carbon molecules, just like what we talked about yesterday with the Calvin cycle. And so this would be a C3 plant because it ends up making a 3-carbon molecule, right? And this would be kind of the normal. It can take mainly CO2. It might do a little photorespiration, but this is the norm. And that's a C3 plant, okay? Our second plant would be a C4 plant. And C4 plants are adapted differently than C3 plants. A C4 plant makes basically an organic acid intermediate to release CO2. And so in a C4 plant, you're dealing with 2 different cells. And so we could kind of draw them out here. So we have like a mesophyll cell. And then what happens is in that mesophyll cell, it's going to take in CO2 during the day and actually kind of convert it to a 4-carbon molecule. And this is where it gets that C4 name. And then it can actually process it through like pyruvate. And get that CO2 later to Rubisco. So here we're kind of having a 2-part process where it's converting it to this 4-carbon organic acid and then going ahead and completing the process to release CO2. And so kind of an extra step, right, for these C4 plants, but still making it possible for them to use carbon dioxide and make glucose and, you know, really do the process of photosynthesis. And then the third type of plant are CAM plants, okay, and these are going to be like our cactus that needs something kind of drastic to help them. And basically, a CAM plant is going to make an organic acid during the night. And so they're going to actually use night to their advantage. And so we can kind of draw out that cell there. And in a CAM plant, they're going to take in CO2 at night when it's cooler. You know, something that lives in just really hot environments, if they've got their stomata open all day, they get so dehydrated it kills them. And so they're going to take CO2 in at night. They're going to make a organic acid during the day. And then they're going to process that CO2 to the Calvin cycle. And that is a CAM plant. Okay? And so basically you're seeing the C3 plant, which is basically kind of the normal. C4, which has a little bit of an adaptation for hot environments and to kind of keep from doing photorespiration. And then we have a CAM plant that has this kind of drastic adaptation in a way that it's evolved to really survive in really extreme areas. And so, you know, the big difference between them is how they use their CO2 and when they use it. But they all get to the kind of the same final product. Number 4 said, where do C4 plants evolve and why are they found in these areas? Hot areas, intense sunlight, because these guys even are working with partially closed stomata. They're not going to keep their stomata open all the time. So these are both adaptations to keep from, you know, once they close those stomata, they don't want that O2 to gather into the Calvin cycle, right? So these are ways to kind of close stomata, but keep photorespiration from happening. You know, number 5 said, how do CAM plants deal with the fact that their stomata are closed during the day? Well, they take in their CO2 at night, right? And they turn it into this organic acid. It can't sit there. And so in both cases, the CO2 can't sit there. And so it's got to convert and kind of be stored as an intermediate until it can actually be used in the Calvin cycle. So that's kind of in a nutshell the difference between the C3, the C4, the CAM, kind of this idea of adaptations that plants need to do to be able to live kind of in these extreme environments. There's a few more questions that are more review based that we may go over a little bit on Monday. But what I'd like you to do today, now that you've kind of gone over these notes, kind of like we did before, if you look at your textbook and go to the C3 and C4 section of your textbook, and you can use the ones that are in my room too. Okay, so read over this section, and then I want you to do this concept check 10.5, just to kind of wrap that up. Okay, and we're kind of getting close to being done with this chapter, so hopefully this stuff is making sense to you. There's some kind of images of what we just talked about. There's sugarcane, which is a good example of the C4 plant, and there's a pineapple, which is a good example of a CAM plant. You can see that mesophyll cell and the bundle sheath cell, and then you can also see the night and day nature of the CAM plant. So those are kind of just some adaptations you need to do, or need to know. So if you guys will go do this concept check and turn that in on Google Classroom, and I hope to see you all soon.